Start the recording. Welcome everyone to nRhythm's webinar on how to lead for resilience. We have a really fun session planned for you all today with a little bit of a preview of our upcoming Regenerative Leadership Program that begins in October. I know a few of you are here to learn more about that program. And we just want to thank you all for taking an hour in your day to be here with us. It's great to see familiar faces and a few new ones. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tay Lottie. I'm based in Santa Cruz, California, and I'm part of the nRhythm team. And I'm joined here by today's presenter and our Regenerative Leadership Program facilitator, Jeff Sue. I'll give a quick spiel about nRhythm too for those who are unfamiliar with us. So we're a global design and management firm focused on revealing potential in people and organizations via the with life approach to organizing. We work with networks, communities, organizations, and individuals, offering kind of a range of support from one-on-one consulting and operational design and management support to loads of different online capacity building resources, workbooks, online courses, tools, and a global online learning community that a lot of you have come in here through that are all just empowering us to come together to design healthy, resilient organizations with life in mind. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Jeff, to kick us off today.
Great. Thank you, Tay. Great to see you all. Yeah, my name is Jeff. I'm talking today from Amherst, Massachusetts. Just a little bit about myself for those who don't know my background. I started my career as an ecologist and conservation biologist, and then left academia many years ago and have run a number of different organizations and networks focused on environmental work, on social change work. And so what you'll hear today is something I've been thinking about for a long time, which is, how do we take the learnings we know about managing natural systems and how do we apply that to an organization and think of ourselves as an organization. So I'm going to share my screen. I would ask if you have the internet capabilities, would love to see your face, would love to see your reactions. It's good to have a little bit more interaction when possible in this amazing technology, but also kind of limiting technology that we all are living in now. But wonderful to have people joining from all over the world. It's incredible. So I'll share my screen. Great. Everyone see the slides?
Yep.
Excellent. So welcome. We're here to talk about leadership and we're here to talk about resilience. And we will do all of that. And first, just want to give a little bit of grounding for those who don't know us, kind of what our foundational beliefs are, our foundational thoughts. And so everything we do at nRhythm is built around what we call our with life approach. And to explain that, it's easiest to have you all reflect on some questions. So I'm sure you're all here today because you're all interested in bringing something into the world, whatever that is, whatever context that is for you all. And I'm sure I want to ask you to think about who would you want to do this with you? Who shares this passion and purpose with you? Or who do you wish to share this passion and purpose with you if it's something in the future, something you are here to maybe create? And then really the focus of our webinar today is, well, how will you work together for this shared purpose? And this can be in whatever context. It could be an organizational context, a family context, a community context. And in all of those contexts, we say, if you are doing this, if you are getting together with a group of people with a shared purpose, you are organizing. This is organizing. And even if it's just two of you, you're creating an organization. And so the with life approach is about organizing with life. It's a approach to organizing that holds the patterns of living systems at its foundation. And so whether you're here organizing in a business context, a policy context, a government context, community work, we believe the With Life approach empowers us to create healthy and resilient organizations. So we want to start a little bit about what's the current state of organizations in the world. Many of you have seen this who have been part of our programs, but if you haven't, Gallup puts out a poll every year asking people to self-identify how engaged they are with their workplace. Only 23% say that they are thriving at work. Uh, Almost 60% say they are quiet quitting or not engaged. And 18% self-identify as loud quitting, which on the survey includes active sabotage of the organization that they work for. And Gallup puts a economic cost to this. They estimate this is a $8.8 trillion US dollars in lost productivity a year, or 9% of global GDP. Just a little bit more from that survey on leadership, that they found that only 23% of employees trust the leadership in their organization. 81% believe that leadership is crucial, and particularly the ability to lead through complexity and ambiguity is required. And self-identifying 63% say they lack the leadership development to meet the demands of their role. So why are we in this state? Why do we have this gap in leadership, this gap in employee engagement? We believe this is fundamentally a design issue and how we are designing our organizations. And that the dominant model of organization is this idea that we should act like a machine, and an organization should be organized like a machine. If one Googles, how do I run my organization better? These are the images you get. Articles like 5 ways to run your company like a well-oiled machine. Depictions of your business and departments of your business as gears with profit falling out the bottom of the funnel. Or this is deeply embedded in our language. By a show of hands, how many people have used one of these terms in the last couple months? Working like a well-oiled machine. I don't have bandwidth for that. I've got to dial that in, move the needle. We need to hit the reset button. We actually have as a joke, a virtual kind of swear jar at nRhythm. And when one of us sort of accidentally, just by habit, uses a term like this, we were like, oh, okay, we put a little, virtual dollar in the virtual swear jar. And we share this because language is such a great mirror for our mindsets, right? The idioms we use, the kind of terms we use, it shows us what our deep held kind of foundational ideas are. And many of them are all these very mechanistic, machine-based idioms. My favorite, really, I'm old enough to, have seen this one. I don't have bandwidth for that emerge in my professional career. And I remember when I first heard someone say that, I was like, wow, what we're using internet terms now when we're referring to our own like life force and passion making it equivalent to access to internet speed in our home or in our workplace. So interesting to think about language. And so what are the consequences of leading organizations as machines? And this, when you, in the course, in our leadership course that we'll talk more about, we go into a much deeper exploration of this, but we just want to talk about it briefly here. One of the biggest consequences is if we're looking at a machine and we're monitoring a machine, what is our primary focus? If we're building cars, our primary focus, and it should be, on the productivity of those machines, on the efficiency of that machine. And we want to have predictable outcomes, right? We want the cars to be similar, and we want them to be safe, and we want them to be reliable. And it is pretty amazing what manufacturing has been able to do. But if we are thinking about our organizations and the people in our organizations as machines, then that is one of the major consequences. Because if we're just focused on productivity and efficiency of people, then we see a greater and greater trend, which is this. As of 2023, almost 70% of North American employers with 500 plus employees are using these types of employee monitoring software, logging keystrokes, capturing random screenshots to see what one is doing, monitoring application use. We are taking the leadership or the monitoring approaches to machines and applying them to people and just focusing on their productivity and efficiency. In the course, we go deeper into a case study in Amazon warehouses, and Amazon warehouses have mastered this to a next level where employees' performance evaluations and their raises and their compensation are measured first by number of barcodes scanned per minute is their first measure of employee engagement. And so how did we get here? Again, in the course, we do a much deeper dive into this because it's fascinating. But as a brief summary, we talk about how this mechanistic view of the world, this idea of the world being a machine and therefore organizations being machine, really arises in Western Europe between the 1500s and 1700s in the so-called Age of Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution. And it was an important cultural movement at the time, particularly for Europe, because, this ability to predict and understand through prediction and experimentation, the work of Newton and Descartes and some of our seminal thinkers of Western Europe, disrupts this idea of divine rights and universal power of the church in Europe. Unfortunately, we took that same approach that worked so well and works pretty well for the narrow view of understanding physical forces that Newton's laws of physics, and we now used that and applied that same thinking to almost all aspects of human experience and of our society. And so we go deeper into some shadows of this mechanistic thinking, including this idea of reductionism, that we can understand complex systems by just understanding the parts. This idea that mind and matter are separate, which was Descartes' main theses. This idea of an objective and independent observer being able to be separate and there being an expert outside of the system. And the idea of materialism, not consumerism, not wanting to buy things, but materialism as in that everything is, the world is made up of atoms and basic building blocks of material, and that the world is made up of things versus processes and flows. And we go into a much deeper history of this. But all of this leads to a dominant idea that actually reality or the universe as a whole works like a giant machine. In the 1700s, it was the dominant sort of theological idea or cosmological idea was that the universe works like a giant clock. And this idea of a clockwork universe, one can see it being referenced in many different ways. All of this comes together and is really applied directly to organizations based upon the work of this man named Frederick Winslow Taylor. And he brought together all of these thinkings and he coined the term scientific management. It's really the predecessor to assembly line manufacturing. And he's the person that coined the term that time is money, right? Again, thinking about people. This was based upon some time budget studies of people in manufacturing and people in factories in the early industrial revolution. And in addition to bringing all this mechanistic productivity and efficiency ideas to the workplace, in particular, he had a particularly negative view of what work is. And I think this rings pretty true to a lot of subconscious ideas of how many of us approach work or how we think of work traditionally. And he said that work consistently mainly of simple, not particularly interesting tasks. And the only way to get people to do them is to incentivize them and properly monitor them carefully. He also had a particularly negative view of workers. This is another quote. He said, "One of the very first requirements for a man who is fit to handle pig iron as a regular occupation is that he shall be so stupid and so phlegmatic that he more nearly resembles in his mental makeup the ox than any other type." Um, and we put these two quotes here because if we think about our large organizations and Amazon warehouse, a large corporation, we people would not say this explicitly, but this mental model is built into how we think about work, how we think about what work is, how we think about we need to lead people and lead work. And so we are believe this is what's leading to the state of the workplace that we talked about in those Gallup polls. And we just want to recognize that this dominance of mechanistic thinking is really, hopefully, we hope, kind of a blip in human history, right? Sometime between the 1500s and hopefully, in another 20 years, we all can work together and change this. But it's in deep contrast to the reality held by so many traditions, philosophical wisdom, spiritual traditions that existed before this time period, exist contemporary in this time period, exist now and even in the 1500s. And just to mention a few, very different than the mental model, the foundational thoughts of Asian and Eastern philosophies like Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism that have a more holistic view, a more relativistic view of reality. And even within Western Europe at the time, the ideas of vitalism, the writings of Heraclitus, Heidegger, even pagan wisdom, all is in deep contrast to this approach. And then we're lucky enough to work with indigenous cultures, have contact with indigenous cultures from the Americas, from Australia, from South Africa and New Zealand, and also recognize that this particular view of reality and therefore organizations is in deep contrast to their deeply held beliefs. And we want to specifically recognize, how did we get here? Was this just an organic growth of a certain mental model? And we don't really think it is. We recognize that this particular model of what organization is, therefore what leadership is imposed throughout the world through European colonialism, through slavery, through white supremacy, and creation of systemic racist institutions. It's advanced and accelerated and reinforced by the Industrial Revolution, by the creation of modern capitalism. And now we really are in a place where this is the dominant model of our organizations, governments, and institutions, and most other social systems. And this view that in many ways I think is more intuitive to us, more connected to us, is somehow more and more pushed into the background. This is summarized beautifully by Meg Wheatley, who wrote an incredible book called Leadership and the New Science. And this is summarizing kind of our general idea of leadership that comes out of this mechanistic thinking. That we as leaders believe we need to hold back the dark forces that threaten to destroy us. And it's a hostile world, and organizations, or we who create them, survive only because we build crafty and smart enough to defend ourselves from these natural forces of destruction. And we want to recognize that perhaps this mechanistic approach is useful for certain kinds of problems, but it's not useful for other kinds of problems. And in particular, we find this distinction very useful. This is pulling together the thinking of many different people who recognize this. But if we think of three general categories of problems, there can be simple problems, complicated problems. So like simple, like baking a cake, complicated, like sending a rocket to space, or complex, like raising a child. And actually, I won't go through all of this in detail, but the point we want to make is that actually simple and complicated problems are really similar. Complicated is just a lot of simple problems put together. So yes, it's more technical to build a rocket and send it to space than it is to bake a cake, but it has a very similar type of problem. It's repeatable. You have a set of instructions. Each of us can bake a cake. We might need to make some adjustments um, if we live at elevation, but we get a repeatable result. Building a rocket is the same. You just need to become a billionaire, create your own organization, make your own rocket, go to space, but they can all do it, right? They all have a recipe. Some of them blow up every once in a while, but it's a repeatable result. But raising a child is something very, very different, right? There isn't a playbook. There isn't a recipe book. You have a set of different interdependent inputs. Each situation is different, unknown assumptions and unintended consequences. And there's multiple paths with multiple answers. And we believe running an organization is much more similar to raising a child than it is to baking a cake or building a rocket and sending it to the moon. And so we believe that we can look to a new model or a different model for what an organization is. If we move away from this idea that an organization is a machine, we can look to an organization. We believe if we look to an organization as a living system, we look to life as a model. And in particular, because living systems demonstrate a type of resilience and dynamic adaptation and emergent outcomes that we don't see in mechanistic systems. And so talk a little bit about idea of resilience, because the word is used in many different ways. And again, in the full leadership program, we spend a lot more time working on this. But as a brief preview, this is the work of a great systems thinker named C.S. Halling, who recognized the difference or coined the difference between the idea of engineering resilience versus ecological resilience. Engineering resilience is he depicted like thinking of a marble inside of a cup. And that cup can roll back and forth. And as long as the marble doesn't roll out, that's sort of this idea that that system is resilient to that perturbation or that change or that disturbance. Ecological resilience is much different. Ecological resilience is the idea that there is actually multiple places for that marble to land. In engineering resilience, once that marble flies out of the cup, then that system breaks down. In ecological resilience, the marble can fly out of one cup and land in another cup, another stable state. So our bodies are a great example of this, actually, our body temperature. So when we have a fever, it's actually if it's not too high and running out of control, it's actually a different stable state for our body to be in, one that's adapted to fight off viruses, fight off bacteria by raising our body temperature. And engineering ideas, there's just right, when our engine overheats, it overheats. There's not multiple places for an engine to exist at. And so engineering resilience can be thought of as the ability to absorb or avoid damage without suffering complete failure. Ecological resilience is defined as the disturbance that an ecosystem can withstand without changing self-organizing processes and structures. And here's a couple examples. Unfortunately, we have heard of in the terrible floods right now because of Hurricane Helene, as well as in Europe this summer, all over the world. And sorry, not sure why that keeps popping up. And this is one idea of what to do about floods. So these are real flood walls created by individuals as a way to deal with rising floodwaters. What's particularly interesting to note is, when one house builds a wall that's big enough to protect it, what happens to all the other water? Right? It just raises the water level for everyone else. So if everyone were to do this, and all the other houses, the water would just keep rising and rising and rising and then overflow again. So this is very much an engineering resilience approach, just build the wall higher and higher. Here's an ecological example. This is a aphid. Any gardeners here? You have aphids in your garden. They're actually these incredible organisms. They actually have two completely different forms of adults. There's a wingless adult and a winged adult. And the wingless adult breeds through asexual reproduction. It buds like our cells, right? It just creates another one out of its body and it doubles and quadruples in exponential growth. The winged adult actually reproduces sexually. And their life cycle is this, that in abundant times, like a summer when there's plenty of food, is when you see the wingless adults. So there's lots of food, there's lots of resources, so they multiply very quickly, and they take advantage of that resource. Once that food starts diminishing in the fall, there's some population trigger. We don't know what it is, but actually, suddenly there's winged forms that emerge. This is not the same individual, these are different generations, but winged forms emerge. And the winged forms are now male and female, and they fly to a different place and mate. And so you get the genetic diversity by having the dispersion. And they overwinter, laying their eggs on peaches and other things. And then when they emerge in the spring as winged adults, fly again to a place where there's lots of abundance. And then there's the next life cycle of wingless adults. So here's a great example of a ecological system that has two very distinctly different processes, two very distinct stable states. And so we talk a lot in the leadership program about how do we think of our organization this way? How do we think of the resilience of our organization as having multiple processes, multiple types of stable states? And I'll go more into that a bit later. So to summarize the contrast, when we start with a machine design, we engineer a set of best practices, right? A set of recipes, a playbook. And then we often adopt those best practices and we make them work in our situation. We create a set of prescriptive structures. And this ultimately degenerates the system that we're part of. In contrast, when we believe we start with a living systems design, we we understand living systems to understand a set of patterns that we can follow. And we use these patterns to create or facilitate a flexible framework that ultimately regenerates the system that we're part of. And one of the major differences is that a machine, because it is degenerating, constantly requires more and more energy from the outside, more and more oversight in a leadership context, more and more management, more and more resources. And industrial agriculture is a great example of this. We can get incredible yields, but they're dependent on adding more and more fertilizer and more pesticides to that soil because we're depleting the inherent nutrients of that soil. In contrast, if we look at regenerative systems or living systems, that ultimately we allow that system to maintain itself. We allow that system to regenerate. And so it ultimately requires less energy externally. And so for us, leading for resilience is all about how do we shift our perspectives and our operations and our leadership from this machine design to this living systems design. And so what are the patterns we recognize in living systems? Again, I'll cover this briefly, but we go into this in a lot more detail in the leadership program. So one is we recognize that we can really only understand living systems from a holistic perspective, that these unique qualities of resilience and dynamic evolution and emergent outcomes are only understood by understanding the whole system. You can't just look at one part of the system. We recognize very unique patterns of organization of living systems, and we try to emulate them in our organization, our organizations we're managing. And so one is that living systems are undergoing constant change, yet there's continuity in overall form. Again, our own bodies are an incredible example of this. We look in the mirror every day. We recognize that we are changing. But if someone meets us 5 years from now, or we meet someone we hadn't seen for 10 years, they still generally recognize who we are, right? It's actually said that each of our cells is replaced on average about every 7 years, but we stay in this general form. We don't wake up one day suddenly as an octopus, although I think that would be fun one day to be an octopus. Um, and so there's this constant change, yet overall continuity. We talked about the differences of dynamic equilibriums versus single optimal states already. That's this idea of engineering versus ecological resilience. And amazingly, living systems are not centrally controlled in any way. These qualities of emergence, adaptation, resilience are emergent from all aspects of the system, and all aspects are important. And then living systems in particular are nested. There's holes within holes. There's whole systems that operate within whole systems, and this is often called fractal. And then finally, we recognize a set of patterns of relationships that we hear about. Living systems are networks often, and this is true, but it's important to recognize that they're networks of relationships, not just networks of things. They're networks of processes. And we go into this deeply in the leadership program, is that how living systems use and process and regenerate energy and information are really unique, and that they go through these cycles of life, death, and birth and regeneration. And they do that through diverse and interdependent relationships through this network. And then finally, living systems are in a constant relationship with their environment. They're not just passively reacting to it. They not only adapt to changes, but they actually actively create conditions that are conducive to life. So if we summarize this idea of an organization, if we look up a definition of a machine in Merriam-Webster, it says a machine is a structure that uses power to apply force and control movement to perform an intended action. So if we replace the word organization there, we get one view of what an organization can be. Versus with this living systems design, we see that life is the system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own identity, where emergence and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And we believe an organization can be led in a way to allow for these patterns to emerge. And so that's how we define regenerative leadership. It's the role of a leader is how do we create conditions for these patterns within the living system and organization to express themselves, right? To create conditions to allow that inherent potential to express itself. It's not something we need to drive or push. And so we, in particular, talk about and present specific tools, specific frameworks of how to design an organization, manage an organization, and monitor an organization to allow these conditions to express themselves. Those of you who are doing our design lab right now, who have done the design lab, that's really a 4 weeks focused specifically on design. The leadership course, in many ways, is then a 6-week follow-up that really focuses on how do we manage and monitor from the same perspective. In both courses, we will learn deeply this framework for how to lead, design, manage, and monitor an organization as a living system. And what we want to introduce briefly is that we see leadership primarily is about managing the underlying health of the organization, right? Again, to use a gardening example, if you have a garden and your tomato is not growing, you can't just pull the tomato harder to make it grow faster. You can't just push it right? You have to create conditions for that tomato to thrive. And so you're managing the underlying health of that system, the soil, the water, the light. And we say the role of leadership is to do the same in an organization, to manage its underlying health. And in particular, we see health in a system as understanding its energy and information. The reason why it's shown as this set of this infinity loop is that we recognize this is a constant process of adaptive change, of adaptive feedback, that we are managing energy and information, receiving feedback from the system, and redesigning. And the main things that we're designing are our understanding is the foundational beliefs that we hold about our industry, about ourselves, about leadership, about people. Do we see them as dumb and phlegmatic, or do we see them as inherently creative and have full of potential? Do we see the purpose of leadership to be one to drive productivity and manage either through sticks or carrots, or do we see it as a way to collectively create energy in the system? These are our foundational beliefs. And we then talk about designing an operational identity, which is an expression of those foundational beliefs. And then we manage that operational identity in a way on a day-to-day basis, ultimately to create emergent outcomes, right? Emergent outcomes are these things that are really emergent of the whole system. It's something we can't completely predict now. And as they emerge, we receive feedback and then we redesign our operational identity. We check back in with our foundational beliefs and we change that operational identity. And this is true for leadership at all levels. This can be redesigning our whole organization, could be redesigning a particular product area, could be redesigning a particular functional area of the organization, like performance evaluations or HR. All of that is how do we touch in with our foundational beliefs? How is this creating energy and information? And how do we design it and redesign it to manage energy and information? I'm going to skip through some of these slides. Just want to leave time for questions. Just real quickly, we further break down operational identity into what we call the context, which is our purpose, our mission, our vision. It's our commitments to equity, it's understanding our supporting environment. And work is what we particularly think of of what we design, right? These are our products, our strategies, the work we're doing in the world. How are we achieving that context? And then we spend a lot of time in the leadership course saying, what are the structures that we need to design in order to first and foremost allow for this movement of energy and information, and secondarily be a platform to perform our work. We normally create structures simply to push our work, and we think of monitoring structures simply to execute on work. So just to talk about that a little more specifically in this frame of this movement, this process, right, that we can think of design as this process of designing our operational identity, this arc of the loop, managing it as our day-to-day management, and then we monitor how energy and information are changing or moving or emerging, and we monitor how our operational identity is an expression or not an expression of our foundational beliefs. So what do we mean by emergent outcomes or letting the potential of a system show itself? This, as I said, we're very inspired by taking a set of approaches that we were using for land management and thinking about how we manage that for our own systems, ourselves. Actually, in a lot of what drove us is we see a lot of organizations out there actually doing great work in what they're putting out in the world and not taking that same thinking and applying it to themselves internally in how they manage themselves. What you'll see, this is a piece of land in Mexico that our friends at the Savory Institute that we've been deeply involved with, many of us started with, used an approach to management very similar to this. And the next picture you see has no added inputs to it, no external water, no external seed, no external energy. It's simply managing it in a way to allow the patterns of life to express themselves, allow the potential that's already there in that land to emerge. And in 4 years' time, it returned and regenerated back to this state. And we use this as inspiration to say, what does it look like in each of our contexts, each of the industries you're in? It's going to be different. But how do we think about the potential of the people in our organization and allow it to emerge and manage it in a way? What's the equivalent of this type of transformation? So we're not the only ones recognizing this. I'd say one thing we often, because we use so many analogies to life and gardens and agriculture, sometimes we can be pigeonholed as sort of just environmentalists or tree huggers. This only works for an environmental context. And actually, many people are recognizing a shift in leadership. This is a quote. I won't tell you from who. I want you to guess what industry this person came from. And those of you who know, oh, that's great. You already know. But says the temptation to lead as a chess master, controlling each move of the organization, must give way to an approach as a gardener, enabling rather than directing. A gardening approach to leadership is anything but passive. The leader acts as a eyes-on, hands-off enabler who creates and maintains an ecosystem in which the organization operates. And we might think this is an environmentalist, a conservationist, someone from from agriculture. This is General Stanley McChrystal, who was the head of the war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and from one of the most traditional top-down command and control organizations created, recognized that approach to leadership was not working for those war efforts. This is, of course, not condoning those war efforts in any way or the political situation, but just recognizing that someone who is in that position of life and death, of high stakes, is also recognizing a new approach to leadership is necessary. And then a similar winner-takes-all high-stakes environment, Phil Jackson, the NBA coach, winner of 11 NBA championships, wrote a great book called 11 Rings on Leadership, said the most we can hope for is to create the best possible conditions for success and then let go of the outcome. So that is the background. That's the foundation for our leadership course. Just a little bit, our leadership program, just a little bit of detail. It's a 6-week program. We spend the first week talking about this idea of engineering resilience and ecological resilience, going much deeper into that. We spend the next 2 weeks of talking about how we can lead for health. How do we lead to create for the cycles and flows of energy and information in our organization? Week 4, we go deeply into this idea of nested structures within living systems and think about how we apply that to decision making and governance in our organizations. Just a little preview, we don't really think that an organization should be a flat organization. We don't see that pattern in living systems, but we also don't believe that living systems or organizations should be a top-down hierarchy of power over either. And we talk about a different model that is modeled on the nestedness, the nested and the structures we see in living systems. We spend the 5th week really talking about the role of monitoring and our role and how do we monitor a living system and how do we adapt from that monitoring. And then last week, we talk about you and your organization's role as a change agent in this movement and the change agent in your movement, the movements you're part of, what you're trying to bring into the world. So it's a 6-week program. It begins next October 22nd. It ends December 5th. We do take a break the week of November 26th for our holiday here in the US. It's a Tuesday. We meet Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 1 Eastern time. And the way each week is structured is Tuesdays, we introduce a lot more ideas of patterns and examples from living systems and different frameworks. So it's Tuesdays much more theory, a bit more of a lecture format. And then Thursdays, we will be presenting case studies from our work with clients and then providing some interactive application or inviting all the participants to apply those frameworks to their own organization. So sort of Tuesday theory, Thursday more practical, more case studies. And throughout that, we present the theory, but we really make sure to highlight the application of our framework, the application of the with life approach to these functional areas and many more of your organization, such as financial monitoring, how to create thriving teams, thinking about decision-making structures, ideas of moving away from accountability structures to this idea of shared responsibility. How do we think about performance monitoring, and how do we design our roles and responsibilities, as well as many other things that show up through the peer-to-peer discussion and everyone involved in the course. So thank you all. Happy to answer any questions, and would love to see you all in the leadership course.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, opening it up. Any questions, thoughts, things that emerge for you listening? I did get one question from Kristen, who's a fellow. If anyone else is a fellow here, I just want to remind you all that the leadership program is part of the fellowship program. So you all get access to the leadership program. And if you need information on that, you can't find it in your fellowship toolkit, feel free to reach out to Fran or Alex or Rachel or Ryan, whoever can support you getting enrolled.
I have to say, I confess I'm completely jacked about this. I think it's brilliant and timely, and I've been working for the last couple of years in terms of the leadership training that I do, and it not only fits nicely, but expands on it so forcefully and shows new ways that this can go, that all I can say is thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I know you are very well versed in many different leadership styles and frameworks out there, so that means a lot, and excited for your participation in the course. So I'm glad you're going to be there. Stacy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. It was wonderful. Currently engaged in the Lift Economies MBA program. So I hope that you'll do this again in the future, a 6-week program. Somewhat maybe of a silly question, but is it possible, or have you seen if the organization itself is not looking to maybe move into a living systems design, is it possible as a leader of a team within your organization to start there? I mean, my assumption is yes, but also looking from a holistic perspective, you know, the organization, you know, as a whole. I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts on that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stacy, for bringing that up. And really so absolutely, for complex organizations or even small organizations, starting with a team, starting with or if it's just yourself as a team, we talk a lot in the course actually about that last week in particular. You know, how do you bring this to whatever your greater system is, whether you're a team in an organization within an industry. It's one thing for you to adopt this approach, but how do you bridge that to a larger organization? How do you be an effective change agent? And I will say a lot of it is not using any of these words, right? So the course is meant to provide you with the foundation, provide you with the kind of knowledge, but then the art of leadership, as we know, is how do we bridge to other audiences? How do we use different words? How do we meet people where they're at? And so we talk about that a lot in the course as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
And Stacy, to more functionally answer your question as well, we do the leadership program twice a year. So it will be available again in the spring if you can't make this time. Other questions?
Yeah, Selena.
Yeah, yes, sorry, Jeff. Yes, I sent you a personal message about, you show a picture first, there is like water and it's full of animals. And then with the regenerative, we see a lot of trees, but no more animals. And for me, this is a big, big question because I already see this in my land. Before there was a river, lots of people put trees. It's really nice. But today there is no more river. It's full of trees. The trees drink all the water. And so I think, have we had a vision more deeply about what we really do and the effects for the animals? And I'm full of question about this.
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. I never thought about, thank you. I never thought about what might be the implication of this. So the first picture, that's not a river, and it's not it's not a natural body of water. It's because of erosion and runoff, all the water in that system is being pooled and eroding into a place and is not being effectively used by the land. Actually, the way the land was brought back was by using animals, by using grazing and using animal grazing. And the fact that they're just not animals in the second picture is by coincidence. So it's not that all the animals have left that ecosystem. So yeah, but happy to, I don't know your particular situation with your river and but just to reiterate, no trees were planted in this. This was managing the soil actually to be able to effectively use the rainfall. And we apply this a lot in the leadership course. It's like, what's our equivalent of runoff, right? We put in all kinds of resources into organizations, and is it actually absorbed and used by the system? And so like, what's the equivalent of effective rainfall in a leadership context, right? What are we throwing at our organization that just runs off and disappears out of the system and pools somewhere else? So thank you for the questions.
We have time for one more question. Javi, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the session. I missed a little bit, but whatever was able to catch, it really resonated. I recently resigned from my job due to a personal health episode, but what remains with me a lot is just the kind of leadership that was not sitting right. And so that's why a lot of this resonates. But also part of me feels that, was there one role, like an HR person, who should be responsible or at least the owner of creating this culture? I know each one of us needs to take our own part in this, but when I was hearing it, it just felt like it was a lot to expect from, it's a lot to expect from everyone, while it should really be a different specific role that's setting the tone for this kind of culture and leadership in the organization. What do you think?
Great question. And first of all, I hope your health is doing well, and I hope that's you're recovering. And unfortunately, that is something close to my heart, my own family, and we see as a result of these work practices in so many ways, right? That just push and push for burnout, and so yeah, just sympathies to you. And in terms of your question, I think it's a really great one. It's a very complex one. On one hand, I think the approaches and principles can really be applied at any level in an organization. And at the same time, we know ultimately, if it's just sort of siloed in an HR department or just as something that's kind of making life a little bit better, but the overall structures of the organization don't change, then it has limited effect, right? So we do in our work, our consulting work, try to, at some point when the organization is ready, really work on those whole organizational structures, because that's what really creates health. But it's different in each situation, and each system has to start somewhere, be applied in different ways. And we definitely can see improvements even in parts of the organization. But that's a lot of who comes to our leadership course, actually, is someone who is in a mid-level position, who may not positionally have the power to just say, this is how the organization is now going to run. And how do we work with that? How do you work with that personally? How do you affect the system you're a part of? We spend a lot of time talking about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for being here. If anyone has any more questions, please just feel free to shoot us an email. I'll be sending a follow-up email with this recording, information, more information about the leadership program, how to enroll. We have a scholarship program. The application periods are open until October 11th. So keep that on your radar as well. And yeah, we're excited to keep connecting with each of you on your regenerative journey. So thanks for being here today.
Thank you, everyone.